Dive into the tragic sagas of 18 screen legends from the golden age who torpedoed their own legacies, left to drown without a lifeline. These were the absolute titans and royalty of the cinema. These were not just actors. They were cinematic deities whose visages dominated skylines, their monikers, scorching the night sky in neon from the heart of Broadway to the glitz of the Sunset Strip. Back in the glamorous epoch of Tinseltown, these powerhouses were doing far more than simply reading lines in front of a camera. They were architects of fantasy, constructing the great American illusion frame by glorious frame. However, strip away the blinding studio lights and the meticulously curated press shots and you find a grim reality. Even Olympus can crumble, and when these idols toppled from their pedestals, they hit the ground in total isolation. You see, the old studio system was not merely a corporate structure. It operated more like the mafia, a sophisticated protection racket, according to a former MGM insider who watched the machinery chew up and spit out countless icons. The deal was simple: keep the cash registers ringing and follow their draconian code, and they would bury your scandals, craft your public persona, and insulate you from the fallout of your bad behaviour. However, the second the ledger shifted from black to red, or you became a headache rather than a hit maker, they did not just hand you a pink slip, they obliterated your existence. The most terrifying aspect of these cautionary tales is not merely the velocity at which these stellar trajectories plummeted into the abyss. It is the absolute bone-chilling coldness with which they were discarded by the very machine that had engineered their ascent. Executives who used to dispatch shady fixers in the dead of night to bribe, beat cops and hush up witnesses suddenly lost the ability to dial a rotary phone. Power brokers who formerly kissed the ground they walked on at red carpet galas would literally cross the boulevard to avoid making eye contact. The Dream Factory has always run on a brutal binary logic, noted a renowned cinematic historian who has spent years digging through the industry's skeletons. Everybody wants to ride the coattails of a winner, but nobody, and I mean nobody, wants to catch the stench of a loser. As soon as the cracks appeared, whether born of tabloid scandal, chemical dependency, sickness, or the unforgivable sin of getting old, the support system did not just fade away. The industry recoiled violently, treating their misfortune like an airborne plague that could infect the bottom line. Take, for instance, the tragic case of a silver screen darling who snapped mentally after enduring years of studio-enforced starvation diets and 18-hour workdays right when she was crying out for salvation. The corporation that had built empires on her back did not send a psychiatrist or a compassionate friend to her bedside. Instead, they dispatched a team of cold-eyed attorneys armed with breach of contract notices and termination clauses. Or consider the heartthrob who realised his romantic preferences would only be overlooked if he continued to play the part of the virile heterosexual family man off-screen as well as on. When forced to choose between living a life of fame or embracing his authentic self, he chose integrity only to find himself blacklisted and untouchable before the ink was dry. The sheer velocity of the betrayal is what truly breaks your heart, observed a biographer who has chronicled the lives of the few who survived the golden age grinder. One evening you are the centre of the universe and you could not secure a booth at Cairo's nightclub without one of these A-listers on your arm. 24 hours later, the same maitre d's who used to bow and scrape are suddenly suffering from convenient amnesia. Hollywood did not just turn the page on its fallen angels. Tinseltown actively ripped the pages out of the history book, pretending their box office billions never happened. Over the course of this video, we are going to unearth the shocking, often suppressed chronicles of 18 legendary performers who watched their kingdoms turn to ash. In some cases, the wounds were self-inflicted. In others, they were the victims of profound cruelty or twisted fate that no one could have predicted. But the common thread binding these tragedies is not just the height of the fall, but the frigid reception waiting for them in the gutter. Total unequivocal excommunication by a business that had previously treated them like royalty. To truly grasp the severity of this, we must first examine the case of America's original comedy King of Titan, who commanded a salary equivalent to $14 million per picture in today's currency. We need to look at how he became the industry's inaugural sacrificial offering, setting a dark precedent for celebrity destruction that would haunt Hollywood for the next century. Have I not been kind to you? Did I not ensure you had a comfortable bed last night, a warm meal, and plenty of spirits to drink? Entry number 1, the tragic tale of Roscoe Fatty Arbuckle, the first superstar to be fed to the wolves. Rewind to September 1921. Roscoe Arbuckle was not just famous, he was occupying the absolute summit of the entertainment world. Paramount Pictures had just signed him to a staggering $1 million contract that is over $14 million in 2026 money, cementing his status as one of the wealthiest performers on the globe. His movies did not just perform well, they shattered box office expectations with the regularity of a ticking clock. He possessed a unique comedic brand, gentle yet incredibly acrobatic, which laid the groundwork for legends like Charlie Chaplin and Buster Keaton, both of whom revered him as a master. Modern audiences often overlook that Arbuckle was more than just a popular face. He was a genuine innovator, explained a historian dedicated to the silent film era. Defying his heavy stature, he moved with the lightness of a dancer, executing backflips and pratfalls with a subtlety that left smaller, fitter actors in the dust. Even the great Chaplin went on record stating that Arbuckle was, without question, the most physically gifted comedian he had ever encountered. But then came Labor Day weekend in 1921. Seeking respite from a punishing filming schedule, Arbuckle decided to host a casual get-together in his suite. The location was the luxurious St. Francis Hotel in San Francisco, a setting that would soon become infamous. One of the attendees was a small-time actress named Virginia Rapp. Tragically, she fell violently ill during the festivities and passed away 4 days later, succumbing to peritonitis triggered by a ruptured bladder. The subsequent fallout annihilated Arbuckle's life with a ferocity and speed that left even the most cynical Hollywood insiders gasping for air. Hinging almost entirely on the dubious testimony of a single partygoer, a woman later exposed as having a long rap sheet of extortion schemes, Arbuckle was formally accused of manslaughter. William Randolph Hearst didn't just report the news, he weaponized it, turning a personal tragedy into the United States' inaugural example of a nationwide media circus. His publications churned out wildly exaggerated and gruesome stories, painting Arbuckle not as a man, but as a depraved monster who had brutally violated Virginia Rapp with a foreign object. The backlash from the general public was instantaneous and absolutely catastrophic, according to historical accounts of the era. Almost overnight, cinema owners across the country yanked Arbuckle's movies from their screens, while Paramount Pictures suspended him immediately, cutting off his income without a second thought. Newspaper editorials didn't just ask for justice, they were bloodthirsty, openly calling for the comedian to be executed. Crucially, this entire witch hunt occurred before a single shred of evidence had been shown to a judge and before anyone actually understood the events inside that San Francisco hotel room. However, the most chilling part of Arbuckle's destruction wasn't the accusations, which later forensic evidence proved were mostly lies, but the terrifying speed at which Hollywood turned its back on him. People who had made fortunes off his comedic genius for years suddenly developed amnesia, claiming they barely had a relationship with him. The very same studio that had once bragged about his contract as a historic milestone now couldn't run away from him fast enough. As a legal historian specialising in this case noted, Arbuckle was forced to endure the nightmare of 3 separate criminal trials. The first 2 proceedings ended in deadlocks, but the third didn't just end in a not guilty verdict. It concluded with something unheard of in legal history. The jury felt compelled to take an extraordinary extra step, issuing a signed formal apology to the defendant, which explicitly stated that a simple acquittal was insufficient for Roscoe Arbuckle. Their statement read in part that they felt a profound and terrible injustice had been inflicted upon him. They emphasised that the prosecution had failed to produce even the slightest proof connecting him to the commission of any crime whatsoever. Yet this unprecedented declaration from the jury, essentially confirming Arbuckle was the victim rather than the villain, arrived far too late to save him. Will Hayes, the man recently installed as the film industry's supreme moral guardian, had already issued a decree banning Arbuckle from ever appearing on the silver screen again. Even though that ban was technically rescinded following the acquittal, The stigma was indelible. He was radioactive and no producer on earth was willing to hire him. Society had already shifted its gaze. Within a mere 3 months, Arbuckle plummeted from being the most loved comedian in America to an unemployable outcast, the historian explained. It wasn't because of any crime he had actually committed. Despite 3 juries finding zero evidence of guilt, the industry viewed him as disposable, sacrificing him to shield themselves from the artificial moral panic engineered by Hearst's tabloids. Eventually, Arbuckle managed to scrape together some work directing movies forced to hide behind the pseudonym William Goodrich. But it was a hollow victory. He never regained even a tiny percentage of the fame, fortune or joy he once possessed. Tragically, he passed away in 1933 from a heart attack, dying the very same day he signed a small contract that might have sparked a comeback at the young age of 46. The historian concluded that the Arbuckle affair created the ruthless blueprint that Hollywood would adhere to for decades to come. The moment a scandal jeopardised the studio's bottom line or reputation, individual careers, even those of massive superstars, were treated as instant trash. It proved that no amount of raw talent, past profits or personal friendship could protect you once the ledger shifted from asset to liability. There is a scene where a character reassures someone they will assist in packing up their life, a haunting echo of how quickly stars are forced to move on. You leave everything behind, perhaps except for the memories of destroying your own creations, much like the snow figures in Meet Me in St. Louis. This brings us to Judy Garland, the icon the system ground into dust. If the history of Tinseltown has a quintessential tragic princess, that title undoubtedly belongs to Judy Garland. From her legendary breakout performance as Dorothy in The Wizard of Oz, to her timeless roles in classics like Meet Me in St. Louis and A Star is Born, Garland wielded a trifecta of thunderous vocal talent, heart-wrenching fragility and a magnetic charisma that hasn't been equalled in nearly 100 years. A musical historian explained that Garland's uniqueness wasn't merely about her technical skill, although her vocal control was certainly phenomenal. It was her utter emotional nakedness. When she sang, you weren't just hearing a melody, you were witnessing a confession from her soul. She didn't just perform a track, she inhabited it so fully that the audience felt they were living inside her deepest joys and darkest pains. Unfortunately, that same raw sensitivity made Garland exceptionally easy prey for the industrialised cruelty of the studio machine. After signing with MGM at the tender age of 13, she was immediately thrown into a controlling environment designed to exploit and eventually break her. The studio executives were relentless, constantly shaming her about her weight and physical appearance. They forced her onto starvation diets and pumped her full of amphetamines to kill her appetite, followed by barbiturates to knock her out when the stimulants wouldn't let her sleep. MGM didn't simply hire Judy Garland as an employee. According to a biographer who has studied her life in depth, they systematically dismantled her ego while engineering a severe chemical addiction that would plague her until her dying day. By the time she turned 16, the studio's medical staff had her on a daily cocktail of pharmaceuticals. A dosage massive enough to land most full-grown adults in the emergency room, also she could sustain an inhuman work schedule. This toxic mixture of intense psychological pressure, sheer physical depletion, and doctor-ordered drug abuse established a chaotic baseline she couldn't escape. By the time she reached her early 20s, Garland was suffering from severe mood instability, along with crippling panic attacks and total physical breakdowns that began to seriously interfere with film production. Instead of seeing her desperate spirals as a legitimate plea for assistance, the studio brass viewed every breakdown as an annoying logistical hurdle to be cleared, typically by shoving more pills down her throat. According to industry historians, the studio's brilliant fix for the disaster they had engineered was to simply double down on the exact toxic strategies that were tearing her apart in the first place. When the potent amphetamines they force-fed her to keep her weight down made it impossible for her to sleep, they did not back off. They simply countered with heavy-duty sedatives to knock her out. And when those barbiturates inevitably left her stumbling and groggy on the set the next morning, the solution was always the same: pump her full of more uppers to get the camera rolling. It was a vicious pharmaceutical carousel. a death spiral masquerading as standard medical procedure that trapped her in a chemical fog she could not escape. By 1950, after a grueling 15-year stretch of this abuse, Garland's physical and mental health had disintegrated so severely that she could no longer function inside MGM's brutal machine. After a string of unfinished pictures and exhausted collapses that led to hospital stays, the executives looked at the bottom line and made a chillingly cold corporate calculation. Judy Garland, the Golden Girl, who had once been their most bankable musical phenomenon, was marked in the ledger as a liability instead of an asset. With zero hesitation or remorse for the monster they had created, they tore up her contract and kicked her to the curb. The biographer noted that the true cruelty of MGM's abandonment lay in the fact that the studio was punishing her for the very symptoms they had systematically induced. They were the ones who supplied the endless stream of narcotics, mandated the impossible 18-hour workdays, and demanded the radical physical alterations that shattered her constitution. Then, the moment she collapsed under the weight of their impossible demands, they discarded her like trash, acting as if her destruction was entirely a result of her own poor choices. Suddenly cast out from the rigid, protective yet poisonous structure of the studio system, Garland found herself fighting a war on two fronts, rebuilding her shattered health and salvaging her reputation. Although she managed to stage some of the most spectacular comebacks in entertainment history, such as her iconic 1961 concert at Carnegie Hall, the cycle of instability and substance abuse never truly left her. Every time she missed a curtain call or stumbled in public, it just added fuel to the industry gossip that branded her as unreliable, unstable, and risky. She was labelled difficult, a bad investment, even though her raw talent was still light years beyond anyone else in the business. A cultural historian observed that the real tragedy of Garland's career extends far beyond the abuse she suffered within the walls of MGM. The true horror is that once the studio washed their hands of her, the trauma they inflicted became the very thing that defined her entire identity in the eyes of Hollywood. The specific mental and physical health issues the studio had manufactured were now weaponized against her, used as valid reasons to deny her work support or rehabilitation. When Garland passed away tragically in 1969 at the young age of 47, every single obituary led with headlines about her chaotic personal life. They focused on the missed shows and the addiction battles, completely failing to mention the institutionalized abuse that set her on that path. The narrative ignored the fact that these demons were installed in her by a system that had controlled her every breath since she was a child. MGM, a company that had built its empire on her back while destroying her body, released a statement of corporate grief, shedding crocodile tears without taking an ounce of responsibility. Ultimately, the historian concluded Garland's heartbreaking story exposes the terrifying disposability of human beings within the old studio system, no matter how famous they were. They built her into a legend, broke her spirit into pieces, and then abandoned her the second she could no longer operate within their destructive parameters. And when she finally died from the damage they caused, they mourned the loss of the talent, while conveniently forgetting they were the ones who killed it. Moving on to number 3, we have the curious case of John Gilbert, often referred to as the voice that was not. As the silent film era drew to a close, there was not a single male actor on the planet who commanded more worship and adoration than John Gilbert. Known as the Great Lover, he used his intense, smouldering gaze and athletic build to secure a level of fame that is almost unimaginable today. He leveraged that insane popularity into a contract with MGM that paid him a staggering $250,000 per picture. That was an astronomical king-like fortune in the mid-1920s, proving just how vital he was to the studio's bottom line. His on-screen romances with Greta Garbo were the stuff of legend, creating electric, passionate moments that cemented them both as the definitive icons of the age. Gilbert wasn't just another famous face. According to film historians, he was the absolute prototype for what a modern male movie star was supposed to be. He specialised in that tricky transition period, embodying a specific brand of intense romantic masculinity that audiences devoured. Women in particular found him completely irresistible, and he set the standard for every leading man who would follow in his footsteps. But this carefully curated image began to fall apart at the seams when sound technology arrived to shake up the industry in 1927. Like every other star of the silent age, Gilbert was staring down the barrel of the talkies, where the audience would finally hear the voice they had only fantasized about. For some actors, this technological leap was a career death sentence, usually because of thick accent speech impediments or vocal tones that killed the vibe. Sometimes a squeaky or rough voice just didn't match the elegant persona they had built up on the silent screen, shattering the illusion instantly. However, Gilbert's situation was far more complex, layered with conspiracy, and ultimately much more tragic than a simple case of a bad voice. Despite the popular urban legends that have persisted for decades, his natural speaking voice was actually perfectly fine, neither high-pitched nor distracting. The thing that actually doomed Gilbert's transition to sound wasn't his vocal cords, but a perfect storm of toxic studio politics. It was a combination of personal vendettas and one catastrophically timed public incident that sealed his fate forever. The historian explained that Gilbert had committed the one sin that was absolutely unforgivable in the rigid hierarchy of the studio system. He had personally humiliated Louis B. Mayer, the all-powerful head of MGM, and for that his career had to be destroyed. Hollywood law is filled with tales of backstage brawls, but few were as consequential as the night John Gilbert reportedly threw hands with Louis B. Mayer. The incident allegedly erupted at a high society party after Mayer, displaying his characteristic lack of tact, made a crude and disparaging comment about Greta Garbo, the woman Gilbert was desperately in love with. The humiliation was public and profound, leading Mayer to swear a blood oath against his biggest star. Witnesses claim the studio mogul didn't just get angry, he got vindictive, telling his inner circle with chilling calm, "I will destroy him." This explosion of personal animosity couldn't have happened at a worse time. It coincided perfectly with MGM's corporate strategy to slash costs during the expensive industry-wide pivot to talking pictures, meaning they were already looking for a reason to void Gilbert's astronomical contract. It was the ultimate Hollywood storm, a perfect lethal alignment of cold, hard corporate accounting and a burning executive-level personal vendetta. Both the studio's bottom line and Mayer's bruised ego would be satisfied by the complete and total professional annihilation of John Gilbert. The weapon chosen for this execution was Celluloid Gilbert's very first major sound film, His Glorious Night, released in 1929. While history shows that Gilbert's actual speaking voice was perfectly adequate, the film's direction and script seemed engineered with malicious intent to make him look like a total fool. The screenwriters forced him to repeat the phrase, "I love you," over and over to his co-star, instructing him to deliver the lines with a breathless, over-the-top intensity that audiences found hilarious rather than swoon-worthy. Whether it was a calculated hit job or just gross incompetence, the result was the same. The film took Gilbert, the screen's greatest lover, and turned him into an unintentional comedy act. A film historian noted that the box office damage from His Glorious Night might have been survivable if the studio had actually wanted their star to succeed. Plenty of other actors stumbled in their first talkies, but they bounced back because their studios protected the asset, investing in better scripts and voice coaches for the next picture. But MGM had absolutely no intention of throwing Gilbert a lifeline. In fact, they were seemingly enjoying the spectacle of his drowning. The situation went from bad to terminal during a major broadcast event. The final nail in the coffin wasn't on a movie screen, but on national radio. Gilbert was reportedly in a dark place, heartbroken over the critical trashing of his film and his crumbling romance with Garbo, and he showed up to the event visibly under the influence. When he stepped up to the microphone, his speech was slurred and erratic, seemingly confirming the vicious rumours that he was physically and vocally incapable of transitioning to the sound era. That single radio disaster was the point of no return, according to media experts who have studied the era. Millions of Americans who hadn't even bothered to see His Glorious Night tuned in and heard their dashing hero sounding nothing like the smooth operator they had fantasized about. The disconnect between his silent, mysterious image and the sloppy, audible reality was a gap too wide for the public to cross. It happened with brutal speed. Literally overnight, John Gilbert went from being the romantic ideal of a generation to a punchline in the industry. Instead of trying to rehabilitate the image of one of their biggest moneymakers, MGM appeared to actively grease the skids for his decline. They began assigning him to B-grade projects with terrible scripts and zero marketing budget, apparently content to let his career bleed out slowly rather than spending a dime to save it. His salary, which had once been a point of pride as the highest on the lot, became a massive liability on the books as his ability to draw a crowd evaporated. By 1933, barely 4 years after the debacle of his first talkie, Gilbert was effectively washed up in Hollywood, a relic of a bygone age. MGM eventually cut him loose, releasing him from his contract and leaving him to fend for himself in a town that worships success and shuns failure. And sadly, no rival studio was willing to take a gamble on a damaged star whose name had become shorthand for the perils of the silent-to-sound transition. The psychological toll was catastrophic. Gilbert, who had once defined Hollywood success, spiralled into severe alcoholism and deep depression. On January 9th, 1936, the end came swiftly. He suffered a massive fatal heart attack at the tragically young age of 38. The coroner's report and death certificate officially listed myocarditis as the medical cause of death. But his close friends and family knew better. They insisted he died of a broken heart, crushed by an industry that built him into a god, only to tear him down for sport when it suited the bottom line. The tragedy of John Gilbert serves as a stark reminder of the unique cruelty embedded in the studio system's DNA, the historian concluded. His voice was never the problem. His career was murdered by the voice of malicious gossip, the voice of cutthroat politics, and the voice of one powerful man's grudge. MGM had the power and resources to save him with minimal effort if they had chosen to do so. But they ran the numbers and decided that destroying him was more profitable than saving him. It is a cold calculation that Hollywood has repeated time and time again, discarding stars the moment they become inconvenient or difficult. Reporters and biographers constantly dig through these old files doing their homework so they can ask the hard questions, ensuring we never forget where the bodies are buried. Case number 4, Ingrid Bergman, the woman exiled for the crime of honesty. Back in 1950, Bergman wasn't merely a movie star, she was a cultural institution. With her glowing, heartfelt performances in masterpieces like Casablanca Gaslight and Notorious, this Swedish icon had come to represent the pinnacle of feminine perfection. She was a paradox that audiences adored, intelligent yet vulnerable, breathtakingly beautiful, yet humble, passionate, but always keeping it classy. In a conservative era where the Catholic Legion of Decency held a terrifying amount of power over what could be shown on screen, Bergman was a unicorn. She was that rare celebrity who managed to charm the cynical highbrow critics while simultaneously delighting the strict moral guardians of the time. Bergman represented something distinctly unique in the landscape of post-war America, explained a film historian focused on women in cinema. She projected a sophisticated European allure that was perfectly balanced with a sense of wholesome, girl-next-door purity. Americans who were just emerging from the trauma and darkness of World War II latched onto her as a beacon of grace and moral clarity. She embodied the very qualities that the public was desperate to believe still existed after years of global bloodshed and chaos. But this carefully manicured pedestal set her up for a fall. Her saintly image made her personal choices feel like a betrayal, shocking the American public to its core. It all started under the scorching Mediterranean sun in 1949 on the volcanic island of Stromboli, where Hollywood's golden girl Ingrid Bergman was filming with the intense neorealist director Roberto Rossellini. Despite being married to the respectable neurosurgeon Peter Lindstrom, with whom she shared a young daughter, Bergman found herself swept up in a passionate illicit affair with the Italian filmmaker that would soon shake the world. If this happened today in our fast-paced world of 2026, a romance like this would barely fuel a weekend of Twitter trends before everyone moved on to the next viral sensation, observed a prominent entertainment industry analyst. However, back in 1950, the stakes were entirely different. For a married woman, especially one branded with Bergman's saintly, wholesome reputation, to publicly engage in an extramarital fling wasn't just a scandal. It was viewed as a direct assault on the moral fabric of American society. The drama exploded into a full-blown crisis when it was revealed that Bergman wasn't just in love, she was pregnant with Rossellini's baby. All while she was still legally bound by marriage to her husband, Dr. Lindstrom, back in the States. In a town built on secrets, most stars would have vanished for a medical vacation or cooked up a fake adoption story, the kind of standard cover-up the studios excelled at orchestrating to protect their assets. But Bergman did the unthinkable. She refused to hide, choosing instead to look the public in the eye and acknowledge the relationship openly. She rushed a divorce from Lindstrom and walked down the aisle with Rossellini in May of 1950, a mere 3 weeks after her freedom was legally granted. According to historians, it wasn't the sin itself that destroyed her career in America. It was her absolute refusal to play the game of hypocrisy. The Hollywood machine had an entire playbook ready for situations like this, designed to bury indiscretions deep underground. They offered secret arrangements, hush money, and carefully spun narratives to minimise the fallout, but Bergman slammed the door on all of it. She insisted on living her truth without shame, and that was the one thing Hollywood's power players could never forgive. The backlash from the public was instantaneous and brutal. It was a witch hunt. She was condemned from church pulpits across the nation as a sinner, and theatre owners boycotted her movies, refusing to put her name on their marquees. The fan magazines that had once worshipped her as the ultimate symbol of class and elegance turned on her overnight branding her a fallen woman who had traitorously abandoned her fans and her own child. But the most shocking twist came from the United States government itself. On April 14th, 1950, the scandal reached the floor of the Senate. Senator Edwin C. Johnson of Colorado stood up and delivered a tirade against Bergman that sounded more like he was describing a war criminal than an actress. He famously labelled her a horrible example of womanhood and a powerful influence for evil words that would hang over Bergman's reputation for decades. It was absolutely unheard of for a sitting US senator to use the federal government's platform to launch a personal attack on an actress, solely because of her romantic life, noted a political historian regarding the incident. Johnson didn't stop there. He actually tried to push legislation that would require all movies to be licensed based on the moral purity of the actors starring in them. This moment stands as a stark reminder of just how hysterical the post-war era was, blurring the lines between entertainment private morality and government overreach. The impact on her career was immediate, catastrophic, and total. Bergman, previously one of the biggest box office draws in the world, was effectively blacklisted from the industry, with her face scrubbed from advertisements for her current films. Scripts and projects that had been written with her in mind were frantically recast with other actresses who hadn't broken the rules. The most heartbreaking consequence was her forced separation from her daughter Pia, who had to stay in the United States with Lindstrom while Bergman started her new life in Europe with Rossellini and their infant. Almost overnight, she went from commanding a salary of $300,000 per picture, an absolute fortune in 1950, to being completely untouchable and unemployable in American cinema, explained the film historian. Unlike other stars who weathered temporary storms and eventually found a back door into the industry, Bergman was completely surgically removed from the American entertainment landscape. Her banishment wasn't a matter of months. She was exiled for years. What makes this story so chilling is the cowardice of her peers. Nobody in the Hollywood power structure dared to come to her defense. Not a single studio executive vouched for her talent, and no director stood up to ask why her private love life should erase her professional achievements. The very same industry that had made millions off her talent simply washed its hands of her, deciding that the PR cost of supporting her was far higher than any money she could make them. Bergman stayed in Europe collaborating on films with Rossellini that, while artistically respected today, were seen by only a tiny fraction of her massive former audience. Through it all, she carried herself with incredible grace, never once running to the press to complain about how unfairly she was treated. However, close friends later revealed that behind the brave face, she was deeply devastated by the sheer hatred coming from the country she had loved. This exile dragged on for 7 long years, an absolute eternity in the fast-moving, youth-obsessed world of show business. Bergman finally made her triumphant return to American screens in 1956 with Anastasia delivering a performance so powerful that even her biggest haters had to bow down to her talent. She secured her 2nd Academy Award for that role, though she was still too unsure of her welcome to attend the ceremony in person. When you look back at it, the irony is staggering. Bergman's only real crime was her refusal to live a lie, remarked the cultural analyst. Countless other stars were getting up to far worse behaviour behind closed doors, but they remained protected because they helped the studios maintain the illusion of moral perfection. Bergman's unforgivable sin was demanding authenticity in a town that was built entirely on smoke and mirrors. Although she eventually reclaimed her throne as acting royalty, that 7-year gap during her prime remains one of Hollywood's most shameful chapters of double standards and moral hypocrisy. It serves as a terrifying wake-up call, demonstrating just how rapidly this cutthroat business can turn its back on you. Even the brightest stars get tossed aside the second they stop playing the game, proving that optics matter way more than the ugly truth. You might be asking, what went wrong? How did we get here? It reminds me of those hushed rumours that circulate on set. Yeah, totally. Well, speaking of dark rumours, let's dig into the story of Peg Entwistle, the most heartbreaking legend attached to the Hollywood sign. Picture this! It is the morning of September 18th, 1932. A hiker trekking through the dry hills above Los Angeles stumbles upon a nightmare right below the massive Hollywoodland sign. Deep down at the bottom of a steep ravine, the hiker found the broken body of a young woman lying still in the dirt. It appeared she had climbed the service ladder of the giant letter H and jumped to her death. Inside her purse, authorities found a suicide note that still chills people to the bone today. It was short and devastating. "I am afraid, I am a coward, I am sorry for everything. If I had done this a long time ago, it would have saved a lot of pain." The note was signed with the initials P.E. It didn't take long to identify her as 24-year-old stage actress Peg Entwistle. Her tragic end would morph into one of Tinseltown's most haunting myths, a brutal symbol of how this industry lures in hopeful souls, hypes them up, and then destroys them without a second thought. As one expert put it, Entwistle's narrative is basically the dark, twisted mirror image of the American dream we are all sold. A cultural historian who studies the law of the silver screen broke it down, explaining how her story exposes the rot beneath the glitter. For every lucky actor who clawed their way to fame and fortune, there were thousands of others who faced nothing but cold rejection, heartbreak, and total irrelevance. The real horror of Entwistle's story isn't just that she died so young. It is that she chose to kill herself using the very landmark that represented the industry that refused to accept her. Born in Wales and growing up in New York City, after losing her mother Peg wasn't some amateur, she was the real deal. She had already built a solid name for herself on Broadway, shining under the stage lights before packing her bags for Los Angeles to chase movie stardom. Her resume was seriously impressive, boasting credits alongside legends like Humphrey Bogart and work with the elite theatre guild. But Hollywood was a whole different beast. The skills that made her a queen on Broadway didn't mean much in a town that valued a completely different type of performance. According to film historians, making the jump from the stage to the silver screen was a nightmare for a lot of classically trained actors. Theatre is all about projecting your voice and making grand gestures for the back row, whereas movies require tiny subtle movements and knowing exactly where the lens is. Some stars adapted and flourished in this new medium, but plenty of others just couldn't figure out the technical shift required for the talkies. For Peg, who was a natural in the live theatre scene, the movie business threw up roadblocks that must have felt like 50-foot walls she just couldn't climb. Her entire Hollywood career boiled down to just one major gig in a thriller called 13 Women, produced by RKO. And even that big break turned into a massive letdown that would crush anyone's spirit. By the time the movie hit theatres, most of her screen time had been slashed in the editing room, turning her pivotal role into nothing more than a glorified cameo. On top of that career heartbreak, she was painfully aware that her bank account was running dry right as the Great Depression was strangling the American economy. The historian noted that what makes this tale so gut-wrenching is the terrible timing of it all. She took her own life just days before 13 Women premiered, so she never got to see that her work, however chopped up, actually made it to the screen. But here is the part that will really wreck you. Rumour has it that a letter arrived at her house the very next day. It was an offer for a lead role in a play, a gig that could have totally saved her career and her life if she had just held on for 24 more hours. Think about the symbolism jumping off the Hollywood sign that structure stood for all the glitz, glamour and empty promises of the business. That act created a story so powerful and macabre that it completely swallowed up the memory of who she was as a person and an artist. In death, she stopped being a woman and became a warning label for the cruelty of the studio system. She is a parable about the toxic side of ambition, a ghost story that has been haunting the Hollywood hills for almost 100 years. The cultural analyst mentioned that her suicide turned her from a struggling worker into an eternal icon of tragedy. The same industry that wouldn't give her the time of day while she was breathing decided to claim her as part of its dark mythology once she was gone. She became the ultimate prototype of the Hollywood casualty. The stunning girl who arrived with stars in her eyes only to find a rejection so heavy it pushed her to jump from the very symbol of the dream factory. What really stands out about Peg's story compared to other fallen stars is her level of isolation. She never quite reached that tier of fame where she would have had a posse or a support network to catch her when she fell. Unlike the big names who crashed and burned publicly, but had people around them, Entwistle was living on the fringes of the scene. She was visible enough to feel the sting of the industry's cold shoulder, but not famous enough to have the friends or connections to help her through the darkness. In a lot of ways, Peg is the face of all those forgotten souls. She represents the thousands of hopefuls who flock to Los Angeles with talent and dreams only to never catch that one break that secures a spot in history. The real tragedy here isn't simply the fact that her life ended way too soon. It is truly heartbreaking to realise that an industry built on discovering diamonds in the rough completely failed to spot her brilliance until it was far too late. She was young, gifted and ready to work, but the machine ignored her until the constant rejection finally broke her spirit. Now, most of the other famous names we are discussing on this list have one big thing in common. They climbed to the very top of the mountain before crashing down to the bottom. But the real tragedy of Peg Entwistle's story is that she never even got the chance to start her climb. The doors were slammed in her face before she could ever step through them. It is a brutal kind of ghosting that Tinseltown still pulls on dreamers today, leaving them broken-hearted and hopeless, though very few reactions are as dark and cinematic as hers turned out to be. We are talking about that infamous final jump from the massive letter H of the Hollywoodland signer move that ended her life but ironically gave her the eternal fame she was chasing. Picture this, one of the biggest stars in the world walking away and saying, "I am quitting this racket to go sell life insurance in Chicago." That is exactly what William Haynes did, proving he was the rare man who valued his self-respect more than his name on a marquee. Back in the roaring 1920s and early 1930s, you could not find a bigger deal than William "Billy" Haynes. He was not just famous, he was the absolute gold standard of Tinseltown's success. As the #1 moneymaker for MGM, he was not just reading lines, he was inventing a whole new vibe for leading men that audiences had never seen before. He perfected the role of the smart-mouthed, slightly arrogant guy who eventually gets taken down a peg and learns to be a better person by falling in love. He had the total package: drop-dead, gorgeous looks, a body built for action, and a sense of humour that was sharp as a tack. It was a fresh, approachable type of manliness that fans in that era absolutely devoured. One expert on classic cinema noted that calling Haynes popular is an understatement. He was actually a quiet revolutionary who changed the game without anyone realising it at the time. Before Billy came along, your typical movie hero was either a sword-fighting action star or a stiff, overly serious romantic lead with zero personality. Haynes flipped the script by creating a character who felt real, using sarcasm and modern attitude to bond with the crowd, making them feel like he was one of them. If you really look at his body of work, you could argue he was the very first modern movie comedian in American history. Because he put so many butts in seats, Haynes became essentially priceless to the big bosses over at MGM. This leverage got him a paycheck that would make your head spin. Plus, he had a say in his projects, which was almost unheard of for actors back in those days. His movies were guaranteed hits, bringing in buckets of cash without any of the behind-the-scenes headaches studios hated dealing with. He was steady as a rock, which was exactly what the executives needed, while the whole industry was freaking out over the switch from silent pictures to sound. While countless icons of the silent era crashed and burned when microphones were introduced, Haynes breezed right through the change without breaking a sweat. In fact, his unique voice and snappy delivery actually made his characters even better, adding a new layer of charm that silent films could not capture. By the time 1933 rolled around, Billy looked untouchable, like he was cemented as one of the kings of Hollywood for good. Everyone assumed his star would just keep rising and that he would be ruling the silver screen for decades to come. But there was a massive secret lurking beneath the surface. While the insiders, the bosses, the co-stars, the pals knew the score, the public had no idea that Haynes was gay and had been happily partnered with Jimmy Shields since 1926. Now, you have to understand that during the pre-code days, Hollywood was a wilder, more relaxed place. Haynes managed to keep his private life under wraps by being careful playing the publicity game and knowing exactly when to keep his mouth shut. Plus, there was this unwritten rule in Tinseltown: you could do whatever you wanted behind closed doors as long as it did not mess with the ticket sales or ruin the studio's brand. A historian focusing on LGBTQ plus themes in movies pointed out that the way old Hollywood dealt with sexuality was way more complicated than we give it credit for. It was not just black and white. There were shades of grey everywhere. There was a massive wall between the industry gossip, what everyone knew at the parties, and the fantasy world they sold to the fans in the magazines. As long as you played the part in public and didn't get caught in a scandal, the powers that be were shockingly okay with lifestyles that didn't fit the traditional mould. But in the early 1930s, that house of cards started to wobble and eventually collapsed due to a perfect storm of trouble. First, the strict enforcement of the Motion Picture Production Code in 1934 put the studios in a vice grip. They weren't just policing the movies anymore, they were policing the people who made them. Suddenly, everyone had to look, act and think like a saint to keep the conservative religious groups from boycotting the theatres. At the exact same time, Louis B. Mayer was tightening his leash on MGM, becoming the undisputed dictator of the studio lot. Mayer was old school and obsessed with family values. He was terrified of any scandal that could tarnish the wholesome image of his beloved studio, and he watched his actors like a hawk. Just as the walls were closing in on the industry, Billy Haynes walked right into a personal disaster that would change everything. In the final months of 1933, police slapped handcuffs on him at YMCA. The official report said morals charge, which was basically polite code for being caught hooking up with another guy. The studio fixers had swept little dust-ups under the rug before, but this was a massive pile of dirt that was impossible to hide. With the whole country swinging toward conservatism and Hollywood under a microscope, this wasn't just a slip-up, it was a nuclear bomb. Even then, experts say the arrest alone might not have killed his career if he had played his cards differently. The real nail in the coffin was how Billy reacted when the boss, Louis B. Mayer, called him into the office and laid down the law. The story goes that Mayer gave him a brutal choice dump Jimmy Shields immediately and enter a sham lavender marriage. The studio would pick a bride and Billy would have to pretend to be the perfect straight husband. If he refused, he could kiss his MGM contract goodbye. Most actors would have caved to save their fame, but Haynes' answer is the stuff of legend. He didn't even blink. He looked the most powerful man in Hollywood in the eye and said, "I am already married," standing tall for his love with Jimmy. When studio boss Louis B. Mayer laid down the ultimatum, marry a woman or get out, Haynes didn't blink, firing back with a response that has become legendary. "I am essentially an actor," he reportedly said, "but I refuse to perform in my own living room." According to cultural analysts, that single sentence was the moment Haynes signed his own professional death warrant, effectively incinerating his blockbuster film career on the spot. He made the impossible choice to prioritise his personal truth over box office glory back in an era when authenticity and Hollywood stardom were viewed as mutually exclusive concepts. It was a level of defiance that almost no other A-list celebrity, past or present, has been brave enough to display when staring down the barrel of a studio ultimatum. The fallout from his refusal was swift, brutal and absolute, leaving no room for negotiation. MGM didn't just fire him, they tore up his contract and effectively blacklisted him, ensuring he was radioactive to every major production house in town. His swan song on the silver screen was a low-budget project called The Marines Are Coming, dumped into theatres in 1934 by a bottom-tier Poverty Row studio. Following that final flicker of screen time, his name was systematically wiped from casting calls, gossip columns, and the glossy fan magazines that had once worshipped him. Just like that, at the tender age of 34 and at the absolute peak of his earning power, William Haines was ghosted by the entire industry. However, what truly separates Haines from the typical Hollywood tragedy narrative is the incredible plot twist that happened next. Instead of begging for scraps, fighting a losing battle against the blacklist, or fading into obscurity with bit parts in C-grade movies, Haines executed a hard pivot away from show business altogether. Teaming up with his partner Jimmy Shields, he launched an interior design empire that would eventually rival the success of his acting career and become one of the most influential firms in the United States. As one design historian familiar with his post-fame life noted, Haines's second act was arguably even more spectacular and impactful than his first. He didn't just decorate rooms, he practically invented the Hollywood Regency aesthetic, a style that would define high-end luxury living for the next 40 years. His client roster was a who's who of Tinseltown royalty, including legends like Joan Crawford, Gloria Swanson and Carole Lombard. These iconic women ignored the studio's banishment orders, remaining fiercely loyal to their friend and hiring him despite the industry's disapproval. By the 1940s, having your home styled by Billy Haines was such a massive status symbol that even the executives who had exiled him were secretly dying to hire him. This extraordinary professional comeback was mirrored by a rock-solid personal life, something that was almost non-existent in the chaotic world of show business. Haines and Shields remained a devoted couple right up until Haines passed away in 1973, proving their bond was unbreakable. Their 47-year romance outlasted nearly every single arranged lavender marriage forced upon his former co-stars by the studio system. Their residence became a celebrated salon, a safe haven where famous friends would gather and marvel at the genuine happiness Haines had found once he escaped the studio's thumb. The most touching part of the Haines saga is that he never seemed to look back with anger or regret regarding the decision that killed his acting dreams. This resilience is a point frequently highlighted by LGBTQ+ historians studying the era. Whenever friends would lament the stardom he had sacrificed or the movie roles he lost, he would reportedly just smile and gesture around his stunning estate. He would point to his thriving business, his beautiful surroundings, and most importantly, to Shields simply saying, "I have all of this instead. I really haven't lost a single thing that matters." The movie industry that discarded him eventually realised the magnitude of their injustice, although the apology arrived far too late for Haines to hear it. Looking back, film historians now recognise him as patient zero, one of the first high-profile victims of Hollywood's institutionalised homophobia. For decades, his story served as a grim warning, a cautionary tale that frightened generations of LGBTQ+ performers into hiding their true selves to protect their paychecks. But as the cultural analyst concluded, Haines's life exposes the ruthless cruelty of the studio system, while simultaneously proving that dignity exists outside its walls. MGM and the Hollywood establishment threw him in the trash simply because he refused to live a lie. Yet he managed to construct a life filled with genuine meaning, artistic expression, and love a legacy that outshines the fleeting film career he left behind. It is that rare, uplifting Hollywood ending where the hero is actually saved. But he wasn't saved by the industry that used him. He was saved by his own guts, his talent, and his refusal to betray his soul. It is like the old westerns say, once the town turns on you, there is nowhere to hide from the bullets. and they will keep firing until they collect the bounty. Moving on to number 7, we have Barbara Payton, a heartbreaking tale that goes from pure glamour to the absolute gutter. Back in 1950, Barbara Payton looked like she was holding a winning lottery ticket poised to become Hollywood's next obsession. With her striking platinum blonde hair and a figure that stopped traffic, the 22-year-old Wisconsin native skyrocketed through the ranks. She went from being a background extra to landing heavyweight starring roles, acting opposite legends like James Cagney in the grit-filled classic Kiss Tomorrow Goodbye. Studio executives were practically drooling, touting her as the heir apparent to Lana Turner's throne. She was the total package, a stunning blonde bombshell who actually had the acting chops to back up the hype. A film historian explained that Payton possessed that unteachable X factor, the magnetic quality that separates a true movie star from someone who is just good looking. The camera absolutely adored her, capturing a rare mix of raw sensuality and fragile vulnerability that hooked audiences instantly. There was a certain roughness to her presence on screen that felt real, a sharp contrast to the overly polished, manufactured actresses of that time. Unfortunately, this rocket ship to stardom was about to malfunction and crash before it even reached orbit. It wasn't a question of whether she had the chops or the charisma on screen, she had that in spades, but rather that the bigwigs decided her off-screen antics were simply too toxic for a starlet on the rise. The tabloids absolutely feasted on Payton's chaotic romance, turning her private affairs into a public spectacle when she got tangled up in a messy, high-profile tug-of-war between two leading men, Francho Tone and Tom Neal. Things went from dramatic to downright dangerous in a heartbeat. Neal snapped and delivered a savage beating to Tone that landed the latter in the hospital with a laundry list of horrors, smashed nose-brain concussion and a face practically shattered in multiple places. As one historian pointed out, this bloody love triangle was the absolute worst-case scenario for the studio executives, a public relations nightmare that they were desperate to avoid at all costs. Even though the ticket-buying public might have secretly loved devouring every salacious detail in the papers, the movie houses were terrified of anything that might put a crack in the pristine, wholesome facades they built for their stars. They were obsessed with maintaining a squeaky clean reputation, doubly so because they were operating under the strict watchful eye of the draconian production code that governed Hollywood morality. Since Payton was painted as the femme fatale who sparked this brutal brawl between two jealous lovers, she became the easiest target for the industry's wrath, leaving her exposed and defenseless. The backlash was immediate and merciless. Almost overnight, casting directors slammed their doors in her face, refusing to even look at her for any part that mattered. Warner Brothers dropped her like a hot potato, declining to renew her deal, and the other major players in town wouldn't touch her with a 10-foot pole, fearing the radioactive fallout from her scandalous reputation. Fast forward to 1955, a mere 5 years after she burst onto the scene, and she was already scraping the bottom of the barrel, stuck doing cheap, sleazy exploitation flicks just to keep working. It was a heartbreaking nosedive crash for a woman who only a blink of an eye earlier had been rubbing elbows and sharing scenes with the absolute kings and queens of the silver screen. Cultural analysts emphasise that the most shocking part of Payton's tragedy wasn't just the fall itself, but the sheer velocity at which the entire town turned its back on her. She didn't slowly fade away or slide down the ladder rung by rung. It was an instant brutal exile where the machinery of Hollywood simply spat her out the moment she was branded as trouble. The very same executives who had spent fortunes moulding her into the next big thing were suddenly tripping over themselves to cut ties and pretend they never knew her. As her career evaporated into thin air, her private life started spiralling out of control, creating a perfect storm of misery. Her marriage to Francho Tone imploded in less than 8 weeks, and every romance she chased after that turned out to be just as explosive and fleeting as the last. With the decent paychecks drying up completely, the bills started piling up, forcing her into more and more frantic attempts to cling to the glamorous lifestyle she had briefly tasted. Historians note that by the time the late 1950s rolled around, Payton's circumstances had shifted from difficult to absolutely catastrophic. Her bank account was empty, the phone had stopped ringing with offers, and she began a heartbreaking slide into the darkness that would consume her final years. Seeking some kind of escape from the pain, she drowned her sorrows in the bottle, a habit that only made her even more toxic to the few people left who might have hired her. This created a vicious, self-destructive cycle that dragged her all the way down to the streets, forcing her into selling her body just to survive. It was a total devastating collapse, a fall from grace so absolute that you'd be hard-pressed to find another story in Tinseltown that matches its bleakness. The last 10 years of her existence stand as a grim monument to how cold and heartless the industry can be when it decides to throw someone away. Come the early 1960s, the same stunning beauty who had once graced glossy magazine covers as the next big thing was reduced to walking the pavement of Sunset Boulevard soliciting strangers for cash. In a cruel twist of irony, she often found herself plying her trade just a stone's throw away from the very movie palaces that had once lit up her name in neon. It's said that old friends and Hollywood big shots who spotted her on the corner would literally cross to the other side of the road to avoid her. They couldn't bear to face the living, breathing wreckage that served as a stark reminder of how thoroughly the Hollywood machine chewed up and spat out its own children. Cultural critics find it especially haunting how the powers that be didn't just fire her, they effectively scrubbed her from history, treating her like a mistake to be corrected. The tragedy wasn't merely the lack of employment, it was a collective gaslighting where the entire entertainment ecosystem acted as if Barbara Payton had never walked onto a set. Actors who had once kissed her on screen refused to speak her name, and the studios locked her film reels away in the vault, burying her legacy deep underground. It was a calculated total excommunication meant to ensure her tragic reality didn't stain the glossy, perfect fantasy world they were selling to the public. The end came in 1967 when Payton passed away at the shockingly young age of 39. If the papers bothered to print an obituary at all, it was usually a short, dismissive blurb that harped on her tabloid scandals rather than her undeniable skill as a performer. The same dream factory that had once cashed in on her beauty and promise went silent. No memorials, no look-backs, not a single tribute to mark her passing. There wasn't even a whisper of admission regarding how the system itself had pushed her toward that edge and watched her fall. As historians conclude, Barbara Payton isn't just a sad story. She is the ultimate grim warning about how easily talent is discarded like trash in the ruthless world of show business. To think she went from being groomed for the A-list to working the street corners in under 10 years is almost impossible to comprehend, yet it happened. And the kicker is it didn't happen because she lost her spark or because the fans stopped caring. It happened because a business model based on fake perfection simply couldn't tolerate a real, flawed human being whose chaotic life poked holes in the fairy tales they were peddling. In her darkest hour, when she was crying out for a lifeline, absolutely no one reached out to pull her back from the brink. It serves as a cold, hard reminder that Hollywood's love is always temporary, always transactional, and completely conditional. As she hauntingly confessed, "I tell you, I don't believe I'll ever find a moment of peace for the rest of my days." Number 8. Lupe Velez. The extinguishing of the Mexican Spitfire's final flame. Back in the 1930s and the early part of the 1940s, Lupe Velez hit Tinseltown like a Category 5 hurricane, unleashing a raw kinetic energy that moviegoers had never witnessed before. She earned the moniker the Mexican Spitfire, a title that perfectly captured her fiery persona and screen presence. In those blockbuster movie serials, Velez didn't just show up. She absolutely exploded onto the screen with a wild, unfiltered energy that totally smashed the stiff conservative vibes of Depression-era America. To put it simply, Velez was starting a revolution all on her own, noted a cinema historian who has spent years chronicling the massive yet often overlooked impact that Latin American talent had on the foundations of early Tinseltown. She absolutely refused to be pigeonholed into those tired, offensive cliches, putting her foot down to demand lead roles instead of settling for playing the maid or the spicy, exotic side character. Sure, her iconic Mexican Spitfire persona was hot-tempered and acted on impulse, but the character was also whip-smart, hilarious, and undeniably the main attraction of every scene she was in. In a time when Hispanic performers were usually shoved into the background to fill space, Velez had the guts to demand top billing on the marquee, and she actually got it. I have honestly never seen you look so breathtaking. Coming in at number 9, we have Jean Tierney, a tale of flawless beauty shattered by unimaginable heartbreak. Back in the early 1940s, Jean Tierney was basically the gold standard for high-class Hollywood glamour, with her features carved like marble, that signature overbite, and those hypnotic green eyes. She projected a kind of high society elegance that put her in a totally different league from other starlets of the day. However, it was her powerhouse acting in grit-filled classics like Laura Leave Her to Heaven and The Ghost and Mrs. Muir that proved she was way more than just a pretty face for the cameras. She was a seriously talented artist with an emotional range that could leave you breathless. Tierney had this unteachable X factor when the cameras rolled, explained a film expert who focuses on the dark, moody world of film noir. She had this rare ability to look incredibly fragile one second and terrifyingly dangerous the next. There was always a secret lingering behind her gaze, a hint of buried trauma that made her perfect for playing complicated women with deep psychological scars. But what the ticket-buying public couldn't see beneath that polished movie star exterior was a woman fighting a losing battle against crushing personal disasters and the mental health collapse that was waiting in the wings. The first domino to fall, and honestly the most devastating one of them all, revolved around the birth of her daughter Daria back in 1943. While Tierney was carrying the child, she unknowingly caught German measles from a fan who had snuck out of quarantine just to grab an autograph from the superstar during a tennis match appearance. That rubella infection ended up causing catastrophic damage to the developing baby. According to a medical historian analysing the files resulting in Daria being born with severe deafness, partial blindness and major cognitive disabilities. You have to remember, this was an era before doctors really understood the nightmare of congenital rubella syndrome. So for this young mother, the diagnosis came out of nowhere, completely shocking and without any clear explanation at the time. The weight of that tragedy shattered Tierney's emotional stability, leaving scars that would stick with her for the rest of her life. But the knife was twisted even deeper years later at a swanky Hollywood party, where she actually crossed paths with the specific fan who had infected her. The woman walked right up to Tierney and cheerfully bragged about how she had broken her quarantine rules just to meet the star, having zero clue that her selfish choice had destroyed a child's life. Finding out the exact reason for her daughter's condition and realising it was entirely preventable, if not for one fan's reckless stupidity, sparked a level of trauma that Tierney could never bounce back from, observed the cultural analyst. That moment kick-started a psychological spiral that would eventually wreck her career and came frighteningly close to ending her life. By the time the late 1940s rolled around, even though she was still a box office draw, Tierney was drowning in severe, unmanageable depression. After going through a messy, painful divorce from fashion designer Oleg Cassini and dealing with the relentless stress of caring for her special needs child, she started isolating herself from her co-workers and acting in ways that set off alarm bells for everyone in her inner circle. The studio bosses, who cared way more about squeezing every dime out of her fame than her health, kept forcing her into high-pressure roles, even though she was clearly falling apart. What is truly messing up about the Tierney situation is just how long the studios kept grinding her down for profit, while totally turning a blind eye to the flashing red lights of her psychiatric breakdown, the historian pointed out. It got to the point where she would freeze up on set, completely forget where she was, or zone out in a dissociative state in the middle of a scene. Instead of getting her to a doctor, the production crews would just work around her breakdowns, often bringing in body doubles to film the scenes she was too mentally paralysed to finish. Everything finally snapped in 1953 when Tierney, who was suffering from what we would now call bipolar disorder, with psychotic features, tried to take her own life by stepping off the ledge of her mother's apartment building. After that terrifying incident, there was no way to sweep her condition under the rug anymore. And the studio fixers couldn't spin the story or manage it behind closed doors. She was dragged into a hospital against her will, kicking off a brutal cycle of institutional stays that involved horrific procedures like insulin shock therapy and high-voltage electroconvulsive treatments. The second Tierney's mental struggles hit the tabloids, Hollywood turned its back on her with brutal speed, said the cultural analyst. The exact same executives who had made a fortune off her talent while ignoring her pain now looked at her as damaged goods, writing her off as a liability that was too risky to insure or hire. Scripts that were practically written for her were instantly handed over to other actresses, and her name was scrubbed from every upcoming project list in town. It felt as if everyone in Tinseltown had held a secret meeting and unanimously voted to erase her from the map completely. While she was locked away in various institutions for years, fighting the darkest battle of her life, the very machine that had made millions off her pretty face didn't send so much as a fruit basket. All those big shot directors, the high-powered executives and the fellow A-listers who used to clink champagne glasses with her at premieres, they all went strictly radio silent, refusing to say a single word in her defence or offer a crumb of comfort publicly. The massive PR engines that once marketed her as the ultimate symbol of class and elegance suddenly acted like they had lost her file keeping, totally mum about where she was or what she was going through. One industry historian pointed out the nasty double standard at play here, noting how the studio system treated a broken mind far differently than a broken leg. If she had been checking into a clinic for something acceptable like cancer or a heart condition, you bet there would have been fundraisers, massive charity galas and tearful tributes regarding Hollywood's unshakable brotherhood. But because it was a psychiatric issue, the stigma was so toxic that the town's solution was to simply wash their hands of her and act like she was already a ghost. Even though Tierney eventually clawed her way back to sanity and tried to step back in front of the cameras in the late 1950s, her career was essentially dead on arrival. The big studios were terrified to bet money on an actress with a nervous reputation, scared stiff that she might crack up on set or that audiences would be too creeped out to watch. The handful of gigs she actually managed to land were pathetic insults compared to her glory days. Nothing like the deep, complex leading lady parts that had originally made her a legend and proved she had serious acting chops. As one film scholar put it, in the cold, hard math of the studio system, she had shifted from a cash cow to a risky bad investment. The very same business that built her pedestal and cashed the checks she earned them decided to kick her to the curb the second she needed a helping hand. And when she finally got a clean bill of health and was ready to work, those executives refused to put a single dime back into rebuilding the star they had created. It is a brutal reminder that back in the golden age, stars were just products on a shelf, totally disposable the moment they stopped shining, rather than human beings deserving of empathy. Luckily, Tierney did manage to find some peace in her private life, tying the knot again, and basically telling Hollywood to shove it as she stepped away from the limelight. But her professional life, which was once on track to be one of the greatest in cinema history, was completely torpedoed by the way the town turned its back on her. Her tragedy remains one of the grossest displays of how heartless the entertainment business can be, especially when it comes to psychological struggles, setting a grim precedent that would chew up and spit out countless other idols in the decades to come. Yeah, who is this? Oh, Gary, look, I am incredibly sorry, man. I got totally slammed with work and couldn't make it. But hey, let's get back to the list. Coming in at number 10, George Reeves, the man who was literally typecast to death. Back in the early 1950s, George Reeves didn't just get a part, he became a legitimate cultural phenomenon when he donned the cape for the revolutionary show Adventures of Superman. For the millions of wide-eyed American kids glued to those clunky new television sets, Reeves wasn't just an actor reciting lines in tights. To them, he was the man of steel in the flesh, the living, breathing symbol of truth, justice, and everything the country stood for. A broadcast historian explained that the bond between the actor and the hero was absolute in a way that's almost impossible for us to grasp in today's cynical, media-saturated world. It got so intense that kids would actually show up to his public appearances, clutching hurt birds, genuinely convinced that he could use his alien superpowers to heal them right there on the spot. For the vast majority of his fan base, there was absolutely zero distinction between the guy on the screen and the guy signing autographs. But this intense level of fame turned out to be a massive double-edged sword for Reeves. Sure, it made him a household name way bigger than his earlier stint in movies like Gone with the Wind ever did, but it also painted him into a corner he couldn't get out of. Casting directors were terrified to put the guy everyone saw as the virtuous Boy Scout into any role that was gritty, dark or villainous for fear of ruining the illusion. A cultural expert noted that Reeves ended up trapped in a bizarre gilded cage of his own success. He couldn't walk down the street without being mobbed by adoring fans, yet he couldn't land a decent job to save his life. Unless he was wearing the cape. It was a specific kind of hell that the new medium of television was just starting to invent. He became the first major victim of being so perfectly cast that the industry decided he couldn't possibly be anyone else. By 1959, with the 7th season of Adventures of Superman in the can, Reeves was standing at a crossroads trying to figure out his next move. Even though he had been vocal about how much he hated the creative straitjacket or the superhero gig, things were looking up personally. He had just put a ring on socialite Lenore Lemon's finger and was mapping out a future with her. He was also shifting gears professionally, actively setting up meetings to get behind the camera and direct some new projects. Then came the night of June 16th, 1959. Reeves was hanging out at his place in Benedict Canyon with Lemon and a few drinking buddies. The booze was flowing freely, and people there later said Reeves was acting strange, swinging between being snappy and totally checking out mentally. Just as the clock struck midnight, following a spat with his fiancée, he stormed up to his bedroom. A few moments later, a single shot cracked through the silence of the house. When they rushed in, they found the TV icon sprawled across his bed, dead from a bullet wound to the head, with his Luger pistol resting suspiciously between his feet. He had just turned 45, ostensibly in the prime of his life, but the events that unfolded in that upstairs bedroom didn't just end a life. They instantly flipped the script on George Reeves, transforming him from a beloved cultural deity into the subject of a tawdry, tragic tabloid splash, according to industry historians. In the blink of an eye, the Man of Steel, the invulnerable hero who famously shrugged off bullets on screen every week, was lying dead, felled by a single very real gunshot wound to the head. The grim reality of his corporeal death stood in stark, horrifying contrast to the invincible immortality of the character he had played on television for years. The police wrapped up the investigation, quickly stamping suicide on the official file. But let's be real, from the very first moment, the details surrounding Reeves's demise screamed foul play and raised troubling questions that simply wouldn't go away. For starters, get this, there were absolutely zero fingerprints found on the weapon, which is practically impossible. Plus, Reeves's body was covered in strange, unexplained bruises that no one could account for adding fuel to the fire. The most damning piece of the puzzle came from the guests in the house. Multiple witnesses claimed they heard the gunshot go off after Reeves had already gone upstairs, followed by the distinct sound of his bedroom door creaking open and then shutting again. Then there was a chilling pause, a heavy silence that hung in the air before someone finally yelled out that a shooting had occurred, skewing the timeline completely. These glaring inconsistencies have kept the rumour mill churning for decades, feeding wild speculation that has never truly died down, noted a crime historian who has spent years dissecting the case files. Was it actually a cold-blooded mob hit dressed up to look like a suicide, or perhaps a drunken prank involving a loaded gun that spun horribly out of control? Or was it, as the coroner insisted, the desperate final act of a man who felt increasingly suffocated by a spandex roll he loathed and could not escape? Throwing massive shade on the whole situation was Reeves's tangled web of connections to Eddie Mannix, a notoriously powerful MGM executive with deep mob ties and a reputation as the studio's brutal fixer for any problem that needed disappearing. You see, Reeves had been entangled in a long, messy and illicit affair with Mannix's wife, the much older Toni Mannix. Toni was the one who had actually purchased the very house where Reeves died, and word on the street was that she was absolutely shattered and vengeful over his recent engagement to socialite Leonore Lemon. This connection to the Mannix dynasty introduced a dark layer of Hollywood power politics, sparking conspiracy theories that television historians argue have kept this cold case freezing hot for generations. Eddie Mannix certainly had the Rolodex, the muscle and the motive to order a hit and make it look like a tragic suicide to protect his family's pride. However, despite the whispers and the compelling motive, no smoking gun or concrete evidence has ever surfaced to definitively pin the crime on the fixer. What is undeniable is that the shady circumstances cast a permanent dark cloud over Reeves's final moments, forever altering how the public perceived both the charming actor and his wholesome character. Regardless of the truth buried in that bedroom, the impact on his legacy was instantaneous and absolutely cataclysmic for the franchise. Overnight, parents across America were forced into an impossible conversation, struggling to explain to millions of heartbroken children why Superman, their hero, would choose to end his own life. The backlash was so severe that television stations immediately yanked Adventures of Superman from their broadcast schedules in a panic. Executives were terrified of the psychological trauma on young viewers, and when the series finally crept back into syndication years later, it carried a heavy, almost palpable shadow of tragedy. Every time viewers tuned in, there was that nagging knowledge that the invincible hero flying on screen had met a sordid, tragic end in real life. As one cultural analyst observed, Reeves's death fundamentally mutated the Superman brand in ways that resonated through the industry for decades to come. Before this, the character had stood as a beacon of uncomplicated, pure American heroism and absolute invulnerability. Suddenly, that squeaky clean narrative was tainted by extremely adult themes of suicide potential, sex scandals, and the jarring gap between a polished public image and a tortured private reality. It marked a profound loss of innocence, not just for the character of Superman, but for an entire generation of kids who grew up worshipping him. What makes the George Reeves saga particularly poignant in our Abandoned Stars series is just how thoroughly his human identity had been swallowed whole by this single overpowering role. And it highlights just how little support or empathy existed for him as he desperately tried to navigate the complex transition out of the cape and tights. Unlike modern stars who might weather a scandal after building a diverse portfolio, Reeves was so inextricably linked to the Man of Steel that he had no safety net. The industry simply refused to see him as anything else, seemingly unable to conceptualize him as a versatile performer with capabilities beyond flying out of a window. In many tragic ways, Reeves was abandoned by Hollywood long before his actual death, the historian concluded. He was typecast to the point of total professional paralysis, trapped in a gig that made him famous in every living room in America, while simultaneously making him unemployable everywhere else. He represented a terrifying new kind of Hollywood casualty that hadn't really existed before the age of television. He was the first major television star to be so thoroughly defined by a fictional persona that his own identity became a secondary footnote. Whether his demise was self-inflicted or something far more sinister, it underscored the unique vulnerability of performers whose public image becomes a gilded prison from which there is no escape. Look, don't blame me for this mess. Besides, waiting one more day isn't going to change the outcome anyway. Number 11, Montgomery Clift, the tragedy of the most beautiful face in Hollywood being violently shattered. Back in the early 1950s, Montgomery Clift arrived on the scene representing a radical new archetype for the Hollywood leading man. He was sensitive, deeply introspective, and brought a raw emotional vulnerability to his work that stood in sharp contrast to the stoic, granite-jawed masculinity that had dominated cinema for the previous 30 years. Along with contemporaries like Marlon Brando and James Dean Clift, embodied a much more complex, textured vision of American manhood, one that permitted inner conflict, doubt, and psychological depth to shine through. Clift was absolutely revolutionary, explained a film historian who specialises in the evolution of masculinity on the silver screen. Before Clift came along, leading men were generally expected to project unwavering confidence and a standard rugged sort of attractiveness without too many messy feelings. But Clift brought something entirely different to the table, a palpable, vibrating inner life. that you could see right behind his eyes. There was a sense that beneath his extraordinary, almost otherworldly physical beauty lay a deep well of genuine complexity and even tortured soulfulness. Audiences, and particularly women, found this potent combination of fragility and beauty absolutely irresistible, making him an instant sensation. By the time 1956 rolled around, Montgomery Clift wasn't just an actor. He was a full-blown cinematic phenomenon with a magnetic pull that audiences couldn't resist. Having delivered powerhouse performances in legendary classics like The Heiress, A Place in the Sun and the grit-filled From Here to Eternity, he had proven to the world that he was far more than just another pretty face on a poster. He was viewed as a legitimate craftsman, a serious artist who dissected every script with a level of intellectual intensity and emotional dedication that most Hollywood heartthrobs couldn't even fathom. Then came the fateful evening of May 12th, 1956, when Clift headed up into the hills for a dinner party at the Benedict Canyon estate of his best friend. That friend was none other than his A Place in the Sun co-star Elizabeth Taylor, along with her husband at the time, Michael Wilding. Those present would later whisper that Monty seemed incredibly wound up that night, and to take the edge off his visible anxiety, he proceeded to knock back quite a few drinks as the dinner dragged on. When the clock struck midnight, despite his friends begging him to stay because he was clearly in no shape to operate a vehicle, Cliff stubbornly insisted on getting behind the wheel to drive himself back down the mountain. That single decision triggered a chain reaction that would completely rewrite his destiny and alter the trajectory of his stardom in ways nobody could have predicted, noted the cinema historian. The twisting, treacherous curves of Benedict Canyon have swallowed up plenty of drivers over the decades, but few wrecks have scarred Tinseltown's history, quite like the moment Clift met that telephone pole. As he was tearing down the pitch-black canyon road in his heavy Chevrolet, fighting against gravity and his own impaired reflexes, Clift completely lost his handle on the machine, skidding out of control and slamming violently into a utility pole with a sickening, metal-crunching impact. The aftermath was absolute carnage. The crash shattered his jaw, broke his nose, crushed his sinus cavity, and left him with deep facial cuts that would require a marathon of reconstructive surgeries to even partially fix. He likely would have died right there on the asphalt if not for the fearless reaction of Elizabeth Taylor, who heard the bang and sprinted to the wreckage in her couture gown. In a moment of pure adrenaline, she reportedly reached down his throat to fish out his broken teeth, stopping him from choking to death on his own dental fragments, a move that undoubtedly saved his life. But surviving the initial impact was just the opening chapter of a long nightmare, according to a medical expert specialising in the history of celebrity trauma. Clift had to endure a gruelling series of operations in the months that followed, as surgeons tried desperately to piece his shattered skull and features back together. However, the Montgomery Clift, who eventually stepped back into the spotlight after that medical hell, was a ghost of his former self, visibly and undeniably altered from the man who had once been hailed as the most physically perfect specimen in the film industry. The transformation was heartbreaking to witness. His face, once celebrated for its flawless symmetry, now carried a permanent distortion that makeup couldn't hide. The nerve damage left parts of his face stiff and frozen, severely restricting the subtle facial expressions that had been the secret weapon of his acting arsenal. But the most haunting change was in his eyes, which now carried a heavy, permanent look of agony that no amount of acting talent could mask. It was the 1,000-yard stare of a man who had looked death in the face and never really came back from the edge. The crash didn't just rearrange Clift's features, it fundamentally broke his love affair with the camera lens. Before that night, the camera worshipped him, capturing his beauty effortlessly from any angle, but the film historian explained that this dynamic changed overnight. Post-accident filming him became a logistical headache, demanding strategic lighting, very specific good side angles, and heavy post-production editing to soften the scars. What used to be a breeze for cinematographers now required a massive amount of accommodation and special treatment. Naturally, these new technical hurdles quickly translated into a drying up of career opportunities for the troubled star. Directors who would have killed to work with the old Monty were suddenly hesitant to hire an actor who came with so much baggage and required such careful handling. Movie studios, which are businesses first and foremost, started looking at him as a risky liability rather than the golden ticket he used to be. The cruelest blow for Clift was that the romantic leading man roles the bread and butter of his earlier career basically vanished from his table forever. The industry's response was swift and brutal, as noted by cultural analysts who study the dark side of fame, while everyone in Hollywood publicly offered their thoughts and prayers for his recovery. Behind closed doors, executives were quietly slashing his prospects and lowering the ceiling on what they thought he could achieve. The tragedy is that Clift's actual talent hadn't faded one bit. The only thing he lost was his marketability as a conventional pretty boy. But in a town built entirely on smoke mirrors and vanity looks, often matter more than raw ability. Being relegated to the damaged goods pile took a massive psychological toll on Clift. He was already fighting inner demons regarding his sexuality and his discomfort with the fake Hollywood lifestyle, and now he had a daily reminder of how fragile fame really is. He saw firsthand how quickly the public's adoration could curdle into pity or, even worse, total indifference. To cope with the physical pain and the emotional rejection, he began drowning his sorrows in a toxic cocktail of alcohol and prescription pills, starting a downward spiral that made him even harder to hire. What makes this story so gut-wrenching is that even through the haze of addiction, he managed to deliver some absolutely chilling performances, the historian observed. If you look at his work in The Young Lion's judgment at Nuremberg, and especially his raw turn in The Misfits, you see an actor channeling his own brokenness into a depth and sensitivity that is painful to watch. But dragging those performances out of him came at a terrible personal price, requiring more and more chemical crutches just to get him through a day of shooting. By the time the early 1960s arrived, Clift's physical and mental disintegration was obvious to everyone on the lot. Directors from that era shared horror stories of him forgetting his lines mid-scene or needing dozens of takes to nail simple moments that he used to do in his sleep. His once chiselled features were melting away, ravaged by the aftermath of that horrific crash and a spiralling addiction that he just could not shake. Looking at him then, you would struggle to find even a trace of the golden boy who was supposed to rule Tinseltown forever. The transformation was heartbreakingly total. The final curtain fell on July 23rd, 1966, when his lifeless body was discovered inside his New York City brownstone, gone far too soon at just 45 years old. While the coroner typed up heart attack on the death certificate, his inner circle knew the truth. This was the inevitable finale of a slow-motion suicide that started the second his car smashed into a telephone pole a decade prior. Fate had one last twist of the knife in store. His swan song, a picture called The Defector, that came out posthumously, barely saw the light of day and has since faded into total obscurity. It was a tragic, whimpering end for a titan who had practically reinvented acting for the mid-20th century. He deserved a standing ovation, not silence. As one historian put it, the entire arc of Montgomery Clift's legacy was warped irrevocably in the blink of an eye, all because of one wrong turn on a dark, winding road. The real gut punch of this whole saga is the wasted potential. We aren't talking about some mediocre celebrity who got by on looks alone. No, Clift was the real deal, a generational talent with a depth that most performers could only dream of possessing. He was a virtuoso whose fall from grace had absolutely nothing to do with bad acting or a lack of dedication to his craft. Instead, it was sheer dumb bad luck, a random twist of fate that shattered his face and permanently warped the public's perception of their idol. His story stands as a brutal wake-up call, reminding us all that beneath the glitz, the glamour, and the airbrushed perfection, these stars are just as breakable as the rest of us. Darling, I simply have to share this absolutely divine experience I had just yesterday. We were in the thick of rehearsals naturally and decided to pause for a bite to eat. Coming in at number 12, we have the woman who was simply too untamable for the studio machine, the one and only Tallulah Bankhead. You could not put Bankhead in a box if you tried. Between that gravelly, whiskey-soaked voice, a tongue sharp enough to cut glass, and a lifestyle that ignored every rule in the book, she was a force of nature. This Alabama belle didn't just stick to one lane. She conquered the entire map of American entertainment, dominating Broadway, stealing scenes in Hollywood, and captivating audiences on both radio and the small screen. If you were around in the Roaring '20s or the Dirty '30s, you knew her name. She cemented herself as arguably the most electric, can't take your eyes off her presence on the theatrical stage. She had this uncanny ability to mix technical perfection with a raw, gut-wrenching intensity that left ticket holders completely spellbound night after night. One theatre historian didn't mince words, insisting that calling Bankhead talented was an understatement. She was nothing short of a revolutionary figure in the arts. And this comes from a scholar who has dedicated his entire life to studying the nuances of the early 20th century American stage. Back when Tinseltown wanted their starlets to be demure and one-dimensional, Bankhead shattered the mould, delivering performances that were bold, risky, and miles ahead of the curve. She was a chameleon of emotion, flipping from fragile to ferocious or hilarious to heartbreaking in the span of a single monologue. You never felt like she was acting. Her work was so raw and stripped of pretense that it sometimes made the audience squirm with its brutal honesty. That refusal to fake it did not stop when the curtain came down. She lived her personal life with the same reckless abandon, completely ignoring what society expected of a lady, let alone a famous actress. She made no secret of her bisexuality, living her truth out loud during a conservative era, when even a whisper of that kind of thing was enough to torch a career instantly. She drank like a sailor, dabbled freely in recreational substances, and discussed her bedroom escapades with a bluntness that made even the most worldly socialites clutch their pearls. But the thing that really terrified the powerful men running the show was that she absolutely refused to say, "I'm sorry," for any of it. A cultural analyst noted that the industry could handle bad behaviour, but what made Bankhead a nightmare for the suits was her complete lack of shame regarding her lifestyle. Let's be real, plenty of silver screen legends were getting up to no good behind closed doors, violating every moral code in the book. The difference was everyone else played the game, putting on a mask of wholesome respectability whenever the cameras were rolling. Bankhead did not just drop the mask, she stomped on it. Her iconic quip, "I am as pure as the driven slush," sums up her demand that the world take her exactly as she was, mess and all. Naturally, flipping the bird to societal norms put up some massive roadblocks when she tried to transition to the big screen. This became a major issue once the Hays Code clamped down in the early 1930s, forcing Hollywood to police not just what happened in the movies, but how the stars behaved in real life. The big bosses were terrified of a PR nightmare, so they got cold feet about casting a woman whose wild headlines were likely to eclipse whatever character she was playing. They were constantly looking over their shoulders, paranoid that the moral crusaders and decency leagues would boycott their pictures if her name was on the marquee. According to one film historian, if things had been different, Bankhead would easily be remembered today as one of the supreme goddesses of cinema's golden age. She possessed the raw talent, the commanding aura, and that unforgettable smoky voice. All the X-Factor ingredients that elevate a true icon above a regular actor. The only thing she lacked, and frankly refused to ever develop, was the willingness to crush her own spirit just to please the suits. She flat out rejected the plastic cookie cutter persona that the studio system tried to force onto every woman they signed. She did manage to sneak in a few masterpieces, most notably stealing the show in Alfred Hitchcock's 1944 survival thriller Lifeboat. But even with critics singing her praises for that role, her Hollywood resume never came close to matching the legendary status she held on Broadway. As the whispers about her erratic antics and bedroom appetite turned into shouts, the phone simply stopped ringing for movie roles. It was a cold, hard message from the powers that be. No matter how brilliant she was considered too much of a liability to be worth the trouble. As the historian observed, Hollywood did not kick her out overnight. It was a slow, painful ghosting process. There was no official blacklist or dramatic firing squad, just a quiet collective decision to drift away and leave her behind. The offers started drying up, the roles became insignificant, and the projects lost their prestige entirely. By the time the 1950s rolled around, she had effectively been pushed to the sidelines of the film industry, which was ironic considering almost everyone agreed she was one of the most naturally gifted actresses of her entire generation. This professional exile happened right alongside a series of personal struggles that slammed the door on Bankhead's opportunities even harder. Decades of hard drinking and substance abuse had exacted a brutal toll, wrecking not just her physical health, but her ability to show up and do the job. That famously husky voice of hers, once the trademark that made her a star, had deteriorated into a gravelly, raspy mess that audiences sometimes struggled to even comprehend. Even the production companies that might have been willing to look past her scandalous reputation eventually decided they couldn't risk the logistical nightmares her physical condition was causing on set. What makes the later years of Bankhead's career so absolutely heartbreaking is that the raw talent underneath the wreckage was largely untouched. As one theatre historian noted, the spark was still there, even as her body began to fail her in the most public way possible. On the rare occasions when she could muster the strength to back up her artistic instincts, she was still capable of delivering performances that were nothing short of extraordinary. However, those flashes of brilliance became fewer and farther between, turning her into a massive financial risk for producers who cared far more about a reliable schedule than the potential for artistic genius. Fast forward to the 1960s, and Bankhead had been reduced to a tragic parody of her former self. She was reduced to appearing as a cartoonish, exaggerated version of herself on daytime talk shows and in cheesy, campy B-movies. These roles capitalised on her messy, outrageous public persona while offering zero chance to showcase the genuine acting chops that had built her legend in the first place. The very industry that had never really known what to do with her was now inviting her back, but only if she agreed to play the clown. She became the outrageous, hard-living relic whose wild antics could be counted on to shock the audience and boost the ratings. In those final years, Bankhead found herself trapped in a cruel and twisted paradox, according to cultural analysts who studied her fall. The specific traits that had made her too wild for Hollywood's rigid star system, her refusal to behave, her rejection of the rules, and her sheer loudness. Her absolute insistence on living her life and speaking her truth became the only marketable assets the studios were interested in buying from her. The brilliant, nuanced actress was completely swallowed whole by the scandalous tabloid personality, shrinking a complex, multidimensional artist down to a flat, one-note character. When Bankhead finally passed away in 1968 at the age of 66, the obituaries were more interested in reprinting her shocking quotes. They focused heavily on her notorious bad behaviour rather than celebrating the massive artistic contributions she had made to the craft. The entertainment machine that had kept her at arm's length while she was alive suddenly embraced her in death, painting her as a lovable, colourful eccentric. It was a convenient, simplified narrative that completely glossed over both the depth of her talent and the systematic walls she faced. These were the barriers that had actively stopped that talent from ever reaching its true zenith on the silver screen. Bankhead's tragic timeline illustrates a specific, painful type of Hollywood abandonment, the historian concluded. She wasn't taken down by one massive scandal or a single mistake. She was erased by a system that refused to make space for a woman who wouldn't pretend to be someone she wasn't. In a town built entirely on smoke mirrors and carefully crafted lies, her aggressive insistence on authentic self-expression represented a dangerous threat that the studios knew they could never fully control or domesticate. The result is a filmography that, despite its high points, remains just a tiny fraction of what it could have been. If only the system had been brave enough to embrace her extraordinary gifts and her equally massive personality, instead of pushing them into the shadows. As she once remarked about the legions of fans and lovers, she had an enormous number of people, but in the end, she didn't believe any of it truly saved her. Now moving on to number 13, Frances Farmer, the woman who was institutionalized and systematically erased. There are very few Hollywood tales that are as deeply disturbing and dark as the destruction of Frances Farmer. She was a strikingly beautiful and fiercely intelligent performer who first exploded onto the scene with her role in Come and Get It Back in 1936. Farmer represented something terrifyingly new for Hollywood, an actress who treated her job with the intellectual rigour of a scholar. She refused to be used merely as a pretty vehicle for glamour shots or to display conventional watery emotions. Farmer wasn't just talented, she was considered dangerous, explained a film historian who focuses on the suppression of women in classic cinema. She flat out rejected the idea that acting was just about standing on a mark looking gorgeous and reciting lines. She trained with a prestigious group theatre. She was a devotee of the Stanislavski method, and she fought to bring real psychological weight to roles that the studios wanted to keep light and fluffy. This lethal combination of movie star looks and serious intellectual gravity made her a potential revolutionary force. She was existing in an industry that vastly preferred its actresses to be silent, compliant, and uncomplicated. This professional rebellion was matched by a personal independence that was equally rare for women of her era. Farmer was loudly outspoken about political and social justice issues, and she kept close company with known left-wing activists. Doing this during a time of rising anti-communist hysteria was suicide, and she showed zero interest in the publicity games and red carpet ritual studios demanded. She viewed acting as a serious trade rather than a ticket to stardom, an attitude that the powerful men running the industry found both baffling and deeply threatening. The real trouble that the big studio bosses had with Farmer wasn't just that she took her acting craft way too seriously. It was her absolute refusal to play along with the toxic fame game, a point that cultural insiders have emphasised repeatedly. She flat out rejected doing the standard pin-up style photos, wouldn't play along with fake romances cooked up by the marketing teams. And perhaps most dangerously, she spoke to reporters with a level of raw honesty that gave the public relations departments legitimate nightmares. In a time when the movie studios demanded total ownership over every aspect of their female stars' lives, Farmer's demand to just be real was seen as practically an act of war. This professional friction started colliding with her private struggles, creating a perfect storm that the powers that be would eventually use to completely dismantle her life. By the time the early 1940s rolled around, she was constantly locking horns with directors, producers and powerful executives who were infuriated by her unwillingness to bend the knee, both on set and in her personal life. When you combine those heavy career battles with the collapse of her marriage and mounting money problems, you get a pressure cooker of stress that naturally led to some volatile moments and erratic outbursts. The absolute breaking point hit in 1942 when Farmer found herself in handcuffs twice in just a few weeks, marking the beginning of the end. The first run-in with the law was pretty standard stuff involving a simple traffic stop gone wrong. But the second incident was the headline grabber, stemming from a physical dust-up where she allegedly took a swing at a studio hairdresser during a heated argument. Now, for any other star who played by the rules, the studio fixers would have made those charges disappear quietly, but the machine saw this as a golden chance to punish their most difficult asset. What happened next stands as one of the darkest, most twisted chapters in Hollywood history, showcasing a systemic abuse of power that is almost hard to believe. Instead of getting help for a clearly struggling young woman, the industry apparatus teamed up with Farmer's own mother and the courts to kickstart a legal process that would declare her mentally incompetent and drag her kicking and screaming into a nightmare of brutal state-run asylum. Looking back, the legal paperwork used to lock her away was incredibly flimsy. According to legal experts who have gone back and combed through the case files, the case rested almost entirely on her mother's complaints and vague claims about her uncooperative attitude, a label frequently used to silence women who dared to question authority. Yet it was enough to strip Farmer of her freedom and subject her to treatments that today would be classified as straight-up torture. The historical records strongly suggest this wasn't about curing a sick mind, but about controlling and crushing a woman who refused to fit into the industry's box. Once the heavy doors locked behind her, Farmer was thrown into the absolute worst horrors that the mid-century psychiatric system had to offer. Based on her own later memoirs and witness reports, she endured things like insulin shock therapy that induced comas, electroshock treatments with zero anaesthesia, freezing ice baths, and being shackled for days. But the most chilling rumour of all is that she was one of the countless female patients who fell victim to a transorbital lobotomy, a barbaric procedure where a doctor would insert an ice pick-like tool through the eye socket to sever connections in the brain's frontal lobe. Whether that specific surgery actually happened is still debated, but one fact is carved in stone regarding this entire ordeal. The very entertainment industry that had plastered her face on billboards sat back and maintained a deafening silence while she lived through hell. Not a single famous colleague spoke up to demand her release or better treatment. No studio boss asked if it was right to destroy a young woman just because she had a backbone and could be difficult to work with sometimes. The glamorous machine that built her up became an active participant in her destruction simply by doing absolutely nothing to stop it. What really sends shivers down your spine about the Farmer tragedy is just how completely everyone abandoned her, as noted by cultural observers. The moment they slapped that mentally ill label on her, which evidence suggests was more about her bad behaviour than actual sickness, she effectively became a ghost to the studios that had made millions off her talent. There were no charity galas for her defence, no Free Francis campaigns, and zero basic human concern for her well-being. It was as if the entire town of Hollywood had collectively agreed to pretend she had never existed in the first place. When she finally emerged from that nightmare years later, she found that her career was dead and the public had largely forgotten she was ever a contender. This was a woman who was once spoken about in the same breath as legends like Katharine Hepburn, and Bette Davis hailed as the future of serious, gritty female performance. Instead, she was reduced to a spooky cautionary tale, a whispered warning to other actresses about what happens when you fight the system. Farmer's fate represents perhaps the most extreme example of the price paid by stars who refused to bow down to industry demands, the historian concluded. She wasn't just fired, she was erased. She was not merely fired or pushed aside. She was methodically dismantled physically and psychologically by a ruthless institutional machine. These mechanisms of control didn't just happen in the shadows. They operated with the silent nodding approval of the entire entertainment industry hierarchy. This isn't simply a tale of a career being abandoned. It is the disturbing story of a powerful system actively participating in the total destruction of a human being who had the audacity to demand independence within boundaries meant to keep her silent. This vast forest is wide enough to shelter, clothe and feed a brotherhood of good, unwavering men, he famously declared. We need skilled swordsmen, master archers and fearless fighters ready to take a stand against tyranny. Coming in at number 14 is the legendary Errol Flynn, the ultimate swashbuckler, who absolutely dominated Hollywood during the late 1930s and early 1940s. There has arguably never been another male star who embodied the spirit of high-stakes adventure and sweeping romance quite as completely as Errol Flynn did. With his incredible athletic build, that signature roguish grin and unmatched prowess in staged sword fights, the Tasmanian-born icon practically defined the hero archetype in blockbusters like Captain Blood, The Adventures of Robin Hood and The Sea Hawk. For millions of adoring moviegoers across the globe, Flynn represented a very specific and potent masculine ideal that everyone wanted a piece of. He was daring, effortlessly charming, and totally irresistible to women, regardless of whether the cameras were rolling or not. But Flynn was far more than just a popular face. As one film historian specialising in action cinema explained, he was the literal physical embodiment of fantasy brought to life for the masses.